The crystal chandelier above the grand ballroom of the Holloway estate didn't just light the room. It seemed to vibrate with the sheer, suffocating weight of the wealth beneath it. But for Adeline Sterling, the light was a blinding interrogation. Every eye in the room was a needle, and she was being stitched into a garment of public humiliation. Across the polished marble floor, Julian Holloway, the man who had promised her a lifetime just 6 months ago, clutched the waist of a woman whose dress cost more than Adeline's college tuition. He laughed, a bright hollow sound that echoed against the vaulted ceilings, his eyes never once drifting toward the woman whose heart he had systematically dismantled. The betrayal wasn't just that he had cheated. It was the ease with which he had replaced her, parading his new acquisition at the very engagement party that was supposed to have been hers. Adeline's fingers trembled around the stem of her champagne flute. The liquid was cold, but her blood was a riot of white-hot spite. She needed to shatter the glass. She needed to shatter him. She needed a weapon, and in a room full of the city's elite, power was the only currency that mattered. Then she saw him. He was standing alone in the shadows of the arched balcony, a silhouette of sharp lines and lethal stillness. While the rest of the room was a cacophony of colorful silk and loud boastfulness, he was a void of charcoal wool and tempered steel. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't talking. He was simply watching, his presence exerting a gravitational pull that seemed to warp the very air around him. She didn't know his name. He didn't care. She only saw the way the most powerful men in the room steered clear of his radius, their voices dropping an octave when they passed him. He was the sun and everyone else was afraid of getting burned. Adeline didn't think. If she thought, she would die of shame. She set her glass on a passing waiter's tray with a forced steady hand and began to walk. The red silk of her dress hissed against the floor, a warning no one heard. Julian caught her eye for a split second, a smirk of pity forming on his handsome, treacherous face. He thought she was coming over to plead. He thought she was going to make a scene that would only make him look like the prize she couldn't keep. She bypassed him entirely. She walked straight into the shadow of the stranger. Up close, he smelled like rain, expensive tobacco, and something metallic that made the hair on her arms stand up. His eyes were the color of a winter sea just before a storm, gray, vast, and utterly merciless. "Don't move," she whispered, her voice a jagged shard of glass. Before he could respond, before his security detail could even take a step out of the gloom, Adeline reached up, fisted her hands into the lapels of his coat and pulled him down. The contact was a physical shock. Her lips met his in a collision that wasn't a kiss so much as a declaration of war. She poured every ounce of her rage, her discarded love, and her desperate need for vengeance into the act. She felt his body stiffen, a wall of solid muscle that could have crushed her, and for a heartbeat she expected him to throw her across the room. Instead, the atmosphere in the ballroom changed. It didn't just go quiet. The sound was sucked out of the building. The orchestra's violins screeched to a halt. The clinking of silver ceased. A heavy, terrifying vacuum of silence rushed in to fill the space. Julian's glass shattered on the floor. Adeline tried to pull away, her point made, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. But as she moved to retreat, a large, warm hand, calloused and steady, slid around the nape of her neck. Another gripped her waist with the strength of a vice. The stranger didn't let her go. He deepened the kiss, his tongue tracing the seam of her lips with a slow, predatory intent that made her knees turn to water. This wasn't a performance for him. This was a reclamation. He tasted like dark coffee and danger, and as he tilted her head back, Adeline realized with a jolt of pure terror that the room wasn't staring at her because she was scandalous. They were staring because she had just signed her own death warrant. The stranger finally pulled back just an inch. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, smearing her red lipstick against her pale skin. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the gaping Julian Holloway. He looked only at Adeline, his gaze dissecting her soul. "Do you have any idea what you've just done, little bird?" His voice was a low, melodic growl that vibrated in her chest. I wanted him to see," Adeline stammered, the adrenaline finally fading to leave a cold, hollow dread in its wake. "Oh, he saw," the man said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips, a smile that didn't reach his freezing eyes. "The whole city saw. And in my world, what I touch I keep. You just told every man in this room that you belong to Dorian Moretti." Adeline's breath hitched. The name hit her like a physical blow. Moretti. the youngest patriarch of the most feared syndicate in the tri-state area. The man who had allegedly cleared out a rival faction before his 25th birthday. The man who had a strict rule about never being touched by anyone he hadn't vetted. She had just used a monster to spite a boy. I didn't mean. She started, her voice trembling. It doesn't matter what you meant, Dorian interrupted, his grip tightening just enough to be a reminder of his power. You've crossed a line that can't be uncrossed. Look at your ex, Adeline. She glanced over her shoulder. Julian wasn't just angry, he was gray. He was shaking. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost or perhaps his own executioner. He knew exactly who Dorian was. He knew that by touching this man, Adeline had stepped into a circle where Julian's family money and social status meant absolutely nothing. Dorian leaned down, his lips brushing against her ear, his breath hot against her skin. He's terrified because he knows that if he even looks at you now, I'll have to take his eyes. And you're terrified because you're starting to realize that the cage you just jumped into is much, much smaller than the one you left. He pulled her flush against him, his dominance absolute. Welcome to the family, Adeline Sterling. I hope you're ready because I have no intention of ever letting you go. The question wasn't just how she would survive the night. It was what kind of woman she would have to become to survive the man who now claimed to own her. The transition from the suffocating heat of the Holloway ballroom to the clinical chill of the black sedan was so fast Adeline felt as though she had been plunged into ice water. She sat in the back of the vehicle, the leather upholstery smelling of expensive hide and something strangely like cedar wood. Beside her, Dorian Moretti remained a silent, looming presence. He wasn't touching her now, but the space between them felt electrified, humming with a frequency that made her teeth ache. Adeline looked out the window, watching the city lights blur into long neon streaks. Her mind was a frantic loom, trying to weave a sense of reality out of the wreckage of the last hour. Who was she? An hour ago she was Adeline Sterling, the disgraced ex-girlfriend of a real estate mogul, a woman whose greatest ambition was simply to keep her head above water in a social circle that viewed poverty as a contagious disease. Now she was a marked woman. She thought of her sister, Ilara Bennett. Ilara from the haunting echoes of the Hunger Games and Bennett from the classic halls of Pride and Prejudice. Ilara was the only reason Adeline had stayed in this city, the only reason she had tolerated Julian's wandering eyes for as long as she had. Ilara was sick, her medical bills mounting like a slow-motion avalanche, and Julian's generosity had been the only thing keeping the debt collectors from the door. That was Adeline's deepest, darkest fear. Not that she would be hurt, but that her failure to play the submissive doll would lead to Ilara's ruin. Her motivation had never been greed. It had been survival. And tonight, in a moment of blinding, narcissistic rage, she had gambled Ilara's safety for a taste of revenge. You're thinking about how to run. Dorian's voice cut through the dark, smooth and dangerous as a razor blade. Adeline didn't look at him. I'm thinking about how many laws you're breaking by kidnapping me. I didn't kidnap you, Adeline. You chose me. You walked across that floor, you bypassed every safe man in that room, and you laid claim to me. In my world, that's a contract. And I always fulfill my contracts. He turned his head, the passing streetlights illuminating the sharp, aristocratic bridge of his nose and the hollow of his cheek. Dorian was younger than the legends suggested, perhaps 28, but his eyes held the weary weight of a man who had seen centuries of blood. He had inherited the Moretti throne after a tragic accident claimed his father and older brothers, a tragedy whispered to have been orchestrated by the very man sitting next to her. He was a man built on secrets and ironclad rules, the most famous of which was his absolute physical isolation. No one touched Dorian Moretti. Not his subordinates, not his enemies, and certainly not the socialites who threw themselves at his feet. He was the untouchable king, a title earned through a mixture of germophobic precision and a deep-seated distrust of the human touch, which he viewed as a vulnerability. And yet he had kissed her back. He had held her as if he were starving, and she was the first thing he'd seen that resembled food. Why? She whispered, finally turning to meet his gaze. Why didn't you push me away? You could have ended it in a second. You could have destroyed me right there. Dorian leaned in, his shadow swallowing her. Because for the first time in 5 years, someone looked at me and didn't see a boss or a killer or a paycheck. You looked at me and saw a weapon. I found that refreshing. The car slowed as they approached a massive iron gate, the entrance to an estate that loomed like a Gothic fortress against the night sky. Standing by the gate was a man who looked like he had been carved out of granite. Silas Vane. Silas from the shadows of the Da Vinci Code and Vane from the high seas grit of black sails. Silas was Dorian's right hand, his shield and his most loyal shadow. As the car passed, Silas's eyes met Adeline's through the glass, and she saw a flicker of something that looked remarkably like pity. The car came to a halt in a courtyard paved with dark stone. A valet opened the door, but Dorian didn't wait. He stepped out and reached back in, offering his hand. It was a silent command. Adeline hesitated. "I can't stay here. My sister. She needs me." "Your sister's medical bills were paid in full 20 minutes ago," Dorian said casually, as if he were discussing the weather. "The Holloway accounts have been frozen for investigative purposes. A gift from some friends of mine in the banking sector. Julian Crane is currently realizing that he is very, very poor. And you, Adeline, are very, very safe. As long as you stay within these walls." Adeline felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. He had moved so fast. In the time it took to drive across the city, he had dismantled her old life and rebuilt a new one around her. It was a golden cage, polished to a mirror shine, but a cage nonetheless. "What do you want from me, Dorian?" He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming her senses. He reached out, his fingers hovering just an inch from her jawline, resisting the urge to make contact. The restraint was more terrifying than the touch itself. "I want to know why a woman who looks like she was made for sunlight is so comfortable in the dark," he murmured. "And I want to see if you're brave enough to break the rest of my rules." He turned and began to walk toward the massive oak doors of the mansion. "Silas will show you to your quarters. There is a dress on the bed for tomorrow. Don't try the windows. The glass is reinforced and the fall is quite long." As Silas approached to lead her away, Adeline looked up at the towering spires of the Moretti estate. She had wanted to spite Julian. She had wanted to show him that she wasn't a toy he could just toss aside. She had succeeded. Julian was ruined. But as she watched Dorian disappear into the gloom of his home, she realized she had traded a petty thief for a god of the underworld. The intrigue of the house felt alive. Every portrait on the wall seemed to track her movement, every shadow hiding a secret of the Moretti bloodline. She felt a strange, forbidden pull toward the man who had claimed her, a connection born of desperation and the raw, unfiltered power he radiated. She was Adeline Matthews Sterling, a woman who had spent her life being told she was nothing. And in the eyes of a monster, she had finally found someone who saw her as everything. Even if everything meant a prize to be kept under lock and key. Silas led her up a winding marble staircase to a suite that was larger than her entire apartment. The walls were draped in heavy navy velvet, and the bed was a sea of white silk. "The boss doesn't usually bring guests here," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "In fact, he's never brought a woman here. Not once." Adeline turned to him, her heart racing. "Why me?" "Because of the kiss." Silas paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "It wasn't just the kiss, Miss Sterling. It was the fact that you didn't flinch when you saw what he was. Most people see the devil and run. You saw the devil and asked him for a dance. Just be careful. Dorian isn't used to sharing his space, and he's even less used to things he can't control." With that, he closed the door and the click of the lock echoed like a gunshot. Adeline walked to the bed. Laying there as promised was a dress. It wasn't the flashy, trashy silk Julian liked. It was black lace, elegant, timeless, and hauntingly beautiful. Beside it was a small velvet box. She opened it. Inside was a necklace. A single, blood-red ruby suspended on a platinum chain. It looked like a drop of blood against the white sheets. She realized then that this wasn't just a foundation of a new relationship. It was the beginning of a transformation. Dorian wasn't just keeping her, he was remaking her. And the terrifying part wasn't that he was a mafia boss. The terrifying part was that for the first time in her life, she felt like she finally belonged to someone who wouldn't let the world hurt her. But who would protect her from him? The morning didn't arrive with the soft glow of dawn. It arrived with the cold, rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that stood like a sentinel in the corner of Adeline's suite. She hadn't slept. She had spent the night paced between the navy velvet curtains and the white silk bed, the ruby necklace sitting on the nightstand like a bleeding eye. She was a ghost in a house of shadows. Every creak of the floorboards felt like a footstep, Every rustle of the wind against the reinforced glass felt like a whisper of the name she had tied herself to, Moretti. As the sun finally began to bleed over the horizon, painting the room in shades of bruised purple and gray, a soft knock sounded at the door. It wasn't Silas. The knock was too light, too hesitant. Adeline pulled her robe tighter around her, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "Who is it?" "Your breakfast, Miss Thorne," a soft voice replied. Adeline hesitated before unlocking the door. A young maid stood there, eyes downcast, holding a silver tray. But it wasn't the food that caught Adeline's attention. It was the way the maid's hands shook, a tremor so violent the china rattled. "Is everything okay?" Adeline asked, reaching out to steady the tray. The maid looked up for a fraction of a second, her eyes wide with a terror that Adeline recognized. It was the look of someone who had seen behind the curtain. "The boss is waiting for you in the conservatory, Mississippi. He doesn't like to be kept waiting." The warning was clear. Adeline took the tray, her appetite long gone, and dressed in the black lace gown Dorian had left for her. It fit her perfectly, as if it had been stitched onto her skin. The fabric was heavy, expensive, and felt like a shroud. She fastened the ruby necklace around her throat, the metal cold against her skin, and followed the silent corridors toward the heart of the house. The conservatory was a glass-domed cathedral of exotic plants and lethal beauty. Midst the greenery, Dorian sat at a small iron table, reading a newspaper as if he weren't a man who moved the tectonic plates of the city's underworld. He looked up as she entered, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. "Sit, Adeline," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I'm not hungry," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "I want to talk about my sister. You said you paid her bills. I want proof." Dorian folded his paper with surgical precision. "You'll have your proof. But first we need to discuss the price of the kiss you gave me last night. You see, Adeline, in this city perception is reality. And currently, the reality is that you are the only weakness Dorian Volkov has ever shown in public." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "My enemies don't see a woman I saved. They see leverage. They see a way to make the untouchable king bleed. And that makes you the most hunted person in the state." Before Adeline could respond, the heavy glass doors of the conservatory swung open. Silas Vane entered, his face a mask of grim professionality. He held a small charred wooden box in his hands. "Boss," Silas said, his voice low. "This was left at the front gate. Along with the courier." Dorian's expression didn't change, but a terrifying coldness emanated from him. "Open it." Silas set the box on the table between Dorian and Adeline. When the lid was flipped back, Adeline felt the world tilt. Inside the box, resting on a bed of white silk, was a severed finger. It wore a gold signet ring she recognized instantly, the Holloway crest. Julian's ring. Adeline let out a choked gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Is he dead?" "Not yet," Dorian said, his voice devoid of emotion. He didn't look at the finger, he looked at Adeline. "This is a message from the Valerius family. They are the old guard, the ones who think I'm too young, too modern. They've wanted a reason to start a war for years. Last night you gave it to them." "Me? I just kissed you." "I didn't." "You didn't just kiss me," Dorian interrupted, his voice rising just a fraction, the sound like a whip cracking. "You chose a side. The Valerius family had a deal with the Halloways. Julian was supposed to marry into their line to merge their real estate holdings with Valerius's money laundering fronts. Julian was their puppet. And by humiliating him, by choosing me over their interests, you didn't just break Julian's heart. You broke a multi-million-dollar contract." The realization hit Adeline like a physical blow. Julian hadn't just been promiscuous. He had been selling himself, and by extension her, into a web of organized crime. He had been using her as a shield, a normal girlfriend, to mask the filth he was wading in. "He was going to trade you, Adeline," Dorian said, his voice softening into something even more dangerous. "Once the engagement was official, the Valerius family wanted a pure face for their charities. You were the intended sacrifice. Julian wasn't cheating on you because he didn't want you. He was cheating because he was already owned by someone else." Shock turned into a sickening, visceral fury. All those nights she had felt guilty for not being enough for Julian, All those days spent worrying about Alara's bills while he was out working. It had all been a lie. She wasn't just a discarded lover. She was a pawn that had escaped the board. So what happens now? Adeline whispered, looking at the charred box. Now, Dorian said, standing up and walking around the table until he was inches from her. You have to make a choice. The Valerius family wants you back to correct the insult. They will take you, they will use you to get to me, and then they will discard you. Or you stay here. You become exactly what you told the world you were last night. And what is that? Mine, Dorian said. He reached out, his hand finally making contact with her skin. He didn't grab her. He simply traced the line of her collarbone just above the ruby. The heat of his touch sent a jolt of electricity through her that felt like a sin. You will be my fiancé. You will stand by my side at the summit next week. You will show the city that I don't have a weakness. I have a partner. In exchange, I will keep your sister in the best facility in the country, under 24-hour guard. And I will make sure Julian Holloway never sees the sun again. The stakes were laid bare. It was a choice between a slow death at the hands of the Valerius family or a life in the shadows with the man who had just admitted he would own her. Why me, Dorian? She asked, her voice trembling. You could have any woman. You could have killed Julian and ignored me. Why go through this charade? Dorian's hand moved to her cheek, his thumb brushing her lower lip, the same spot he had touched in the ballroom. Because when you kissed me, I felt something I haven't felt in 10 years, Adeline. I felt alive. And I'm a selfish man. I don't give up things that make me feel alive. Suddenly, the silence of the conservatory was shattered by the sound of glass breaking. A red dot appeared on the white tablecloth, dancing toward Dorian's chest. Sniper! Silas roared. Before Adeline could scream, Dorian tackled her to the floor. The sound of a high-powered rifle echoed through the dome, and the chair where she had been sitting a second ago disintegrated into splinters. I can't breathe. This is getting so intense. Adeline is caught between a past that betrayed her and a future that might consume her. What would you do in her shoes? Would you take Dorian's deal or try to run? Let me know in the comments below. And if you're holding your breath like I am, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss the next part of this dark romance. Your engagement helps us keep these stories coming. Dorian held her down, his body a heavy, protective shield over hers. Shards of glass rained down like diamonds, cutting into the expensive rug. Adeline could hear Silas shouting orders into a radio, the sound of boots sprinting on stone and the distant screech of tires. Dorian's face was inches from hers. He didn't look afraid. He looked furious. A small cut on his forehead was bleeding, a single drop of crimson landing on Adeline's cheek. They're early, he hissed, his eyes searching hers. They're trying to take you now. I can't do this, Adeline sobbed, the reality of the violence finally breaking through her shock. I'm just a girl from the suburbs, Dorian. I don't belong in a world where people shoot through windows. He grabbed her chin, forcing her to look at him amidst the chaos. You stopped being that girl the moment you stepped into my light. You're a more Eddie now, even if it's only in name. If you run out those doors, you're dead. If you stay with me, you might live. Choose Adeline. Now. Another shot rang out, hitting the iron leg of the table. The smell of ozone and gunpowder filled the air. Adeline looked at the blood on his face, the raw power in his grip and the terrifying certainty in his eyes. She thought of Alara lying in a hospital bed, oblivious to the fact that her life was being auctioned off in a glass room. She thought of Julian, the man who had tried to sell her like a piece of meat. She reached up, her fingers trembling, and wiped the blood from Dorian's forehead. I stay, she whispered. But I'm not a puppet. Not yours and not theirs. A dark, predatory satisfaction flashed in Dorian's eyes. He stood up, pulling her with him in one fluid motion, keeping his body between her and the window. Good, he said as Silas rushed back in with a tactical team. Because I don't like puppets. I like queens. Silas, get the armored transport. We're moving to the safe house in the mountains. And tell the men. The Valerius family just forfeited their right to exist. As they were swept out of the room by a sea of men in black, Adeline looked back at the shattered conservatory. The red ruby on her neck felt heavier than ever. She had survived the incident, but she realized with a sinking heart that the real danger wasn't the sniper outside. It was the man holding her hand as if he would never let go. The journey to the mountain estate, A fortress of glass and basalt known as the Obsidian Ridge, was a blur of high-speed turns and the rhythmic hum of armored tires against asphalt. Adeline sat in the back of the SUV, sandwiched between the cold glass of the window and the radiating heat of Dorian Moretti. Outside, the lush greenery of the valley had long since surrendered to the jagged snow-capped teeth of the northern range. The air inside the cabin was thick, not with fear, but with an unspoken tension that felt like a living thing coiling around them both. Dorian hadn't spoken since they left the city. He was focused on a series of encrypted tablets, his thumbs flying across the screens as he coordinated a retaliatory strike that Adeline could only imagine in her nightmares. Every few minutes he would glance at her, not with the predatory gaze from the ballroom, but with a clinical, assessing look that made her feel like a chess piece being moved into a defensive position. "You're staring," Dorian said without looking up from the glowing screen. "I'm trying to figure out if you're human or just a very well-dressed machine," Adeline replied, her voice gaining a sharp edge she didn't know she possessed. "People tried to kill us today. They shot at me. They sent a finger in a box. And you're sitting there checking your stocks." Dorian finally set the tablet aside. He turned to face her, his shoulder brushing hers, a contact that sent a jolt of unwanted electricity through her body. "I'm not checking stocks, Adeline. I'm ensuring that the men who authorized that shot never have the breath to order another. And as for being human, you're the one who decided to test that theory in front of 1,000 people last night." The memory of the kiss flashed between them, a vivid sensory ghost. Adeline looked away, her face flushing. "I was desperate. I didn't think." "Desperation is the purest form of honesty," Dorian murmured, his voice dropping to that low, resonant frequency that made her skin prickle. "You wanted to burn Julian's world down. You just didn't realize that I am the fire." The car finally ground to a halt in front of the ridge. It was a masterpiece of architectural intimidation, all sharp angles and dark stone, perched on a cliffside that dropped thousands of feet into a mist-shrouded gorge. Silas Vane opened the door, his face a grim mask under the moonlight. "The perimeter is secure, boss," Silas reported. "But we have a problem. There was a breach at the medical facility where Alara Bennett is being held." Adeline's heart stopped. She lunged out of the car, grabbing Silas's arm. "Is she hurt? Did they take her?" Silas looked at Dorian, waiting for permission to speak. Dorian stepped out of the car, his presence immediately dominating the frozen courtyard. "Speak, Silas." "They didn't get to her," Silas said, looking back at Adeline. "Your security detail intercepted them in the parking garage. But the Valerius family knows she's there. We had to move her. She's currently in transit to our private clinic in the city, but she's scared. She's asking for you." "I have to go to her," Adeline said, her voice cracking. "Dorian, please. She doesn't understand what's happening. She's sick, she's fragile." "You go to her, you lead them straight to her," Dorian snapped, his eyes flashing with a sudden sharp anger. "The only reason she's alive right now is because they don't know exactly where we've moved her. If you step foot in that clinic, you are a beacon. You stay here. You stay where I can protect you. Protect me." Adeline stepped into his space, her rage finally outweighing her fear. "You're not protecting me, Dorian. You're holding me hostage. My sister is the only thing in this world that matters to me, and you're using her as a leash." Dorian's expression hardened into something cold and impenetrable. He took a step toward her, forcing her back against the side of the SUV. "I am the only thing standing between your sister and a shallow grave, Adeline. Julian Holloway didn't just cheat on you. He signed your sister's death warrant the moment he borrowed money from the Valerius family using her medical care as collateral. They don't just want you for honor. They want the debt paid in blood." The revelation felt like a physical blow. Julian had used Alara's life to fund his lifestyle. The betrayal was so deep, so absolute, that Adeline felt like she was drowning. She slumped against the car, the cold metal biting through her lace dress. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. "Because I wanted to see if you would trust me without knowing the full price," Dorian said, his voice softening, though his eyes remained steel. "Now you know. You stay here. You learn how to be the woman the world thinks you are. And in return, I will tear the Valerius family out of the earth by their roots." Is anyone else's heart racing? The layers of betrayal are just peeling back, and it's worse than we ever thought. Poor Adeline is realizing that her entire past was a lie. What do you think of Julian now? Drop a Team Dorian or Team Adeline in the comments. And if you're hooked on this dark romance, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We're just getting started and you won't believe the twist coming in the next act. The next few days at the Obsidian Ridge were a masterclass in psychological tension. Adeline was given free rein of the house, but she was never alone. Silas was a constant, silent shadow, and the security cameras followed her every move. Dorian was a ghost. He spent most of his time in a subterranean war room, but he appeared every evening for dinner. These meals were the most difficult part of her day. They sat at opposite ends of a long ebony table, the silence between them filled with the clinking of silver and the crackle of the fireplace. During these dinners, Dorian began what he called her education. He didn't teach her how to use a gun or how to hide a body. Instead, he taught her the genealogy of the underworld, who was allied with whom, which families were fading and which were hungry for blood. You need to know who is smiling at you because they love you and who is smiling because they're looking for a place to put the knife, he told her one evening, his eyes tracking the way she held her wine glass. In our world, Adeline, there is no such thing as a casual conversation. And what about us, Dorian? She asked, setting her glass down. Is this a casual conversation? Or are you looking for a place to put the knife too? Dorian paused, his gaze dropping to her lips. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the temperature rising until Adeline felt a bead of sweat trace the line of her spine. I don't need a knife for you, Adeline, he murmured. He stood up and walked toward her. His movements were fluid, like a predator stalking through tall grass. He stopped behind her chair, his hands resting on the back of it. He didn't touch her, but his proximity was overwhelming. I brought you something, he said. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small old-fashioned key. He set it on the table in front of her. This is for the locked room at the end of the West Gallery. It belonged to my mother. She was the only person who ever truly understood what it meant to be a Moretti woman. Why are you giving this to me? Because you're starting to look like you belong here, he said, his voice a low vibration against the back of her head. And because I want you to see that I'm not the only monster this family has ever produced. After he left, Adeline took the key. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she made her way to the West Gallery. The iron nest felt different at night, more alive, as if the walls themselves were breathing. She found the door and turned the key. The lock clicked with a heavy, satisfying sound. Inside was a small, dusty library, but it wasn't filled with books. It was filled with journals. Thousands of them. He picked one up at random. The handwriting was elegant, precise. It belonged to Isabella Moretti. As Adeline read, she felt a chill go through her. These weren't diaries of a socialite. They were the ledgers of a strategist. Isabella had been the true power behind the Moretti throne for decades. A woman who had orchestrated alliances and eliminated threats with the stroke of a pen. But as Adeline turned the pages, she found something else. A folded piece of paper fell out. It was a letter dated 10 years ago, addressed to Dorian. My dearest son, it read. They will tell you that to lead is to be alone. They will tell you that touch is a weakness. But remember this. The most dangerous weapon a Moretti has is not the gun. It is the heart of the person who chooses to stand beside them. Do not let them turn you into stone, Dorian. Find someone who isn't afraid of the dark. Adeline's breath hitched. She looked around the room, realizing that Dorian hadn't brought her here to scare her. He had brought her here to show her his soul. He was a man who had been raised to be an island, taught that any connection was a liability. And yet he was keeping his mother's legacy hidden away like a treasure. Suddenly she heard a sound from the hallway. A muffled voice, urgent and hushed. He crept to the door and peered through the crack. It was Silas, and he was speaking to someone on a burner phone. I understand, Silas whispered, his back to the door. The exchange happens at midnight. The boss doesn't know. Make sure the girl is ready. If anything goes wrong, the Valerius family will have all our heads. Adeline retreated into the library, her blood turning to ice. Silas? The loyal shadow, the man Dorian trusted with his life? He was working for the Valerius family? She looked at the journals, then at the key in her hand. The tension she had felt before was nothing compared to this. She was in a house of mirrors, and the only person she might be able to trust was the man who had kidnapped her. But as she heard Silas's footsteps retreating, a new thought entered her mind. What if Dorian did know? What if this was all part of the education? A test to see if she would run or if she would stay and fight. She felt a surge of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Determination. She wasn't just Adeline Sterling anymore, the victim of a cheating ex. She was a woman standing in a room full of secrets, and she was done being the only one who didn't know the rules of the game. She tucked the journal into the waistband of her dress and extinguished the lamp. She had to find Dorian. She had to tell him. But as she stepped into the hallway, a hand clamped over her mouth and a cold metallic barrel was pressed against her temple. "Not a word, Miss Sterling," a voice hissed. It wasn't Silas. It was Julian Holloway. And he didn't look like a man who was afraid of the sun anymore. He looked like a man who had nothing left to lose. The cold, oily scent of Julian's cologne, the one she used to find comforting, but now smelled like rotting flowers, clung to the air as he pressed the gun harder into Adeline's temple. His hand was shaking so violently that the front sight of the pistol scraped against her skin. This wasn't the polished, arrogant Julian Holloway of the ballroom. This was a man stripped of his veneer, a man who had been chewed up by the underworld and spat out into the dirt. "Don't move, Addie. I swear to God I'll do it," Julian hissed, his breath hot and ragged against her ear. "Julian, stop," Adeline whispered, her eyes darting toward the shadows of the hallway where she hoped Dorian or Silas was lurking. "You're in over your head. You can't win this. Dorian will. Dorian is a dead man." Julian's voice cracked, bordering on hysteria. "He thinks he's so smart hiding up here in his mountain fortress. He doesn't know that the Valerius family already has people inside. He doesn't know that your hero is the one who put Alara in that hospital in the first place." Adeline went rigid. The hallway seemed to stretch, the walls closing in. "What are you talking about? Alara was sick long before I met Dorian." "Was she?" Julian let out a jagged, ugly laugh. "Think about it, Addie. The rare condition. The specialized medicine that only one clinic in the city provides. A clinic owned by a Moretti subsidiary? He didn't find you at that party by accident. He's been grooming you for years. He needed a Sterling. He needed you." Before she could process the venom in his words, the shadows at the end of the hall shifted. Dorian Moretti stepped into the light. He wasn't wearing his jacket. His white shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and ink. He didn't look like a businessman anymore. He looked like the butcher the stories described. He didn't have a gun. He didn't need one. His presence alone seemed to drop the temperature in the hallway by 20 degrees. "Julian," Dorian said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "You've made a mess of my floor. Stay back." Julian screamed, pulling Adeline closer, using her as a human shield. "I'm taking her to Valerius. It's the only way they'll let me live. They told me if I brought them the Sterling girl, the debt is wiped." Dorian ignored him, his eyes fixed solely on Adeline. "Adeline, look at me." She forced her eyes to meet his winter-sea gaze. In them she saw a flicker of something she hadn't seen before. Not dominance, but a raw, bleeding vulnerability. "Is it true?" she choked out. "Did you put Alara in that hospital?" Dorian's jaw tightened. "It's more complicated than that. Answer her." Julian shrieked. "Yes," Dorian said, the word heavy as a tombstone. "But not for the reasons he thinks. And certainly not because I wanted to hurt her." "You monster," Adeline breathed, a tear finally breaking free and rolling down her cheek. "I am a monster," Dorian agreed, taking a slow, deliberate step forward. "But I'm the monster that kept her alive when the Valerius family wanted to use her organs to pay off your father's gambling debts. I'm the monster that's been paying for her breath for 3 years. Liars. You're both liars." Julian's finger tightened on the trigger. Suddenly, a shadow loomed behind Julian. With a movement so swift it was almost a blur, Silas Vane appeared from a recessed doorway. He didn't use a gun. He grabbed Julian's wrist and twisted. The sound of bones snapping echoed through the hall, followed by Julian's agonized scream. The gun clattered to the floor. Silas didn't stop. He kicked Julian's legs out from under him and pinned him to the floor with a knee to the spine. "The perimeter is clear, boss," Silas said, his voice flat. The betrayal call was intercepted and traced back to Holloway's burner. "The Valerius scouts in the valley have been neutralized." Adeline stumbled back, her head spinning. The betrayal she had overheard wasn't Silas selling out Dorian. It was Silas baiting Julian. It was all a play. A setup. And she had been the bait. Get him out of here, Dorian commanded, never taking his eyes off Adeline. Take him to the basement. I'll deal with him when I'm finished here. As Silas dragged a sobbing, broken Julian away, silence reclaimed the hallway. Adeline stood trembling, the weight of the last 10 minutes crushing the air from her lungs. You knew, she whispered. You knew he was coming. You let him get that close to me. I needed him to show his hand, Dorian said, stepping toward her. I needed you to see who he really was. If I had just killed him, you would have made him a martyr in your head. I needed you to see the coward. And what about you? Adeline snapped, her voice rising with a mix of fury and heartbreak. You've been tracking me for years? You've been protecting me by keeping my sister sick in one of your clinics? You're just a more expensive version of Julian. Dorian didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. Instead, he reached out and took her hand. His skin was burning hot against her icy fingers. He led her back into the library, the room filled with his mother's journals. My father and your father were partners once, Dorian began, his voice low and gravelly. Your father, Arthur Sterling, wasn't the man you remember. He was a thief. He stole $40 million from the Moretti accounts. My father was going to kill him and everyone who shared his blood. I was 18. I saw you in a park once holding Alara's hand. You were so small. So innocent. I couldn't let it happen. He leaned against the desk, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across his face. I made a deal with my father. I would take responsibility for the debt if he let the Sterling girls live. But the Valerius family found out. They wanted the money or they wanted the leverage. Alara's sickness wasn't a choice, Adeline. It was an attack. They poisoned her with a slow-acting toxin. I didn't put her in the hospital. I built the hospital to find the antidote. Adeline felt the ground shift beneath her. All these years she thought she was a victim of bad luck, of a failing healthcare system, of a cheating boyfriend. She didn't realize she was the center of a war that had started before she could even drive. Why didn't you just tell me? Because I didn't want you to look at me the way you're looking at me now, Dorian whispered. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to cup her face. This time there was no hesitation. No restraint. His touch was a plea. I wanted you to choose me. Not because of a debt, not because of your sister, but because you felt what I felt when our lips met in that ballroom. I wanted to be more than your keeper, Adeline. I wanted to be your escape. The vulnerability in his voice was a revelation in itself. This wasn't the untouchable king. This was a man who had spent a decade in a self-imposed prison of duty and secrets, all to keep a girl he'd seen once in a park from being erased. Oh my God. Everything we thought we knew has been turned upside down. Dorian isn't the villain of her story, he might be the tragic hero. But at what cost? Do you believe him? Or is this just another layer of Mafia manipulation? Let me know your theories in the comments. And if you want to see how Adeline handles this massive revelation, hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Your support keeps us telling these stories. Adeline looked into his eyes and saw the truth. It was a dark, twisted, bloody truth, but it was the first honest thing she had held in years. She realized that her spiteful kiss hadn't been a mistake. It had been an instinct. A soul recognizing its protector even through the mask of a monster. I don't know if I can forgive you for the secrets, she said, her voice barely a whisper. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dorian replied, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. I'm asking for you, all of you. Stand with me, Adeline. Help me end the Valerius line, and I swear to you the day they are gone, you and Alara can walk away. I'll give you a new life, new names, and you'll never see me again. And if I don't want to walk away? She asked, her breath hitching. Dorian's eyes darkened with a sudden, intense passion. He leaned down, his forehead resting against hers. Then God help us both. Because if you stay, I will never let you go. I will burn this city to the ground before I let anyone take you from me again. He kissed her then, and it wasn't like the ballroom. It wasn't a performance or a claim. It was a confession. It was a desperate, hungry collision of two people who had been drowning in the dark and had finally found a breath of air. But as they stood locked in each other's arms, the high-pitched wail of an alarm cut through the house. Dorian pulled back, his face instantly reverting to the cold mask of the boss. He tapped his earpiece. Silas, report. Boss, we have a problem. Silas's voice crackled, sounding strained. The clinic in the city. They didn't just send Julian here as a distraction. They launched a full-scale assault on the medical center. They've taken Alara. Adeline's world shattered. The hope that had just begun to bloom was ripped out by the roots. They have her, she gasped, her legs giving way. Dorian caught her, his grip like iron. His eyes were no longer winter seas. They were pits of hellfire. Silas, get the helicopter ready, Dorian roared. And call the families. Tell them the peace treaty is over. I'm going to war. The revelation was complete. The game had changed. It was no longer about spite or debts. It was about survival. And as Adeline looked at the man who was about to set the world on fire for her sister, she realized she wasn't just his partner. He was his queen. And queens don't run. They conquer. The roar of the helicopter blades was a rhythmic, punishing sound that mirrored the throbbing in Adeline's temples. Below them, the sprawling lights of the city looked like spilled embers, beautiful and indifferent to the carnage unfolding in its shadows. Inside the cabin, the air was freezing, smelling of aviation fuel and the ozone of high-end electronics. Dorian sat across from her, his face illuminated by the flickering blue light of a tactical monitor. He had strapped on a shoulder holster, the dark leather stark against his white shirt. He looked like a god of war, cold and efficient, his eyes stripped of the fleeting warmth they had held in the library. He wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking through her, focused on the logistics of a massacre. Dorian, Adeline shouted over the noise, reaching across the small space to grab his hand. He pulled back. It wasn't a violent movement, but it was a definitive one. Don't, Adeline. I need to be focused. Emotions are for people who can afford to lose. That's my sister they have, she screamed, her voice cracking. I can't just sit here and watch you turn back into a statue. Tell me the plan. Tell me she's going to be okay. Dorian didn't answer. Instead, Silas, who was seated next to the pilot, turned around and handed Dorian a tablet. His face was grim, his eyes avoiding Adeline's. Boss, Silas said, his voice barely audible over the rotors. It just came through. It's a direct feed. Dorian took the tablet. His jaw tightened so hard Adeline thought she heard his teeth grind. He tried to turn the screen away from her, but she lunged forward, snatching a glimpse of the video. The image was grainy, bathed in the sickly green of night vision. It showed a small, sterile room, an isolation ward. In the center was a hospital bed. Alara lay there, her face pale, her breathing labored. She was surrounded by men in tactical gear, their faces obscured by balaclavas. Standing at the foot of the bed was an older man, his hair silver, his suit impeccably tailored even in the gloom. Maximilian Rothstein. Maximilian from the brutal arenas of Gladiator and Rothstein from the high-stakes betrayal of Casino. He was the head of the Valerius family, the man who had ordered the hit on Adeline's soul. Maximilian looked directly into the camera. Dorian, he said, his voice smooth and cultured. You broke the rules. You took something that belonged to the collective interest of the families. You thought you could hide behind a pretty face in a mountain of glass. But the Moretti name doesn't mean what it used to. Not since you let your heart start beating for a sterling. He reached down and touched Alara's cheek with a gloved hand. Adeline let out a strangled sob. The girl is fading, Dorian, Maximilian continued. She hasn't had her infusion in 6 hours. You know the timeline. In another 6, her lungs will begin to fail. In 12, her heart will stop. You have a choice. Bring me the girl you stole from the Halloways and I might consider giving your sister the antidote. If you don't, well, I've always wondered how a Moretti handles a funeral. The screen went black. No, Adeline whispered, her world tilting. No, no, no. We're 10 minutes out from the landing zone, Dorian said, his voice a flat, dead monotone. He stood up, grabbing a tactical vest and sliding it over his head. Silas, tell the second team to move to the perimeter. I want the building leveled. I don't care about the collateral. Dorian, wait. Adeline grabbed the lapels of his vest, forcing him to look at her. He said he'll trade. He wants me. Take me to him, let her go, and then you can do whatever you want. Dorian grabbed her wrists, his grip so tight it left bruises. His eyes were terrifying, wide, bloodshot, and filled with a desperate, animalistic fury. I'm not trading you, Adeline. Do you understand? If I give you to him, he kills you both. He's a Valerius, they don't leave survivors. They leave warnings. But she's dying. Adeline shrieked. You said you'd protect us. You said you'd keep her safe. I failed. Dorian roared, the sound echoing in the cramped cabin. He let go of her wrists, stepping back as if her presence burned him. I thought I had covered every exit. I thought I had bought enough loyalty. But Julian, that pathetic, sniveling coward, he had a back door into the clinic's security system that I missed. This is on me. And I will fix it the only way I know how. By killing everyone? Adeline asked, her voice trembling. That won't save her, Dorian. That just makes more bodies. Sometimes more bodies is the only answer, Dorian said. He turned to the door as the helicopter began its descent toward a darkened rooftop in the industrial district. Silas, take her to the secondary safe house. Lock it down. If anyone tries to leave, shoot them. What? Adeline gasped. No. You can't leave me. Dorian. But the door was already open. The wind whipped into the cabin, a chaotic roar that swallowed her voice. Dorian stepped out onto the skid, looked back at her for one agonizing second. A look of pure, unadulterated heartbreak, and then he jumped. I can't believe this. Dorian is going in blind, fueled by rage, and he's locking Adeline away just when she needs to be there the most. Everything is falling apart. Do you think Dorian is making the right call by refusing the trade? Or is he letting his pride get in the way of Alara's life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I need to know what you think. And if you're as stressed as I am, please subscribe to the channel. This story is reaching its breaking point and you don't want to miss the climax. The secondary safe house was a windowless concrete box beneath a shipping warehouse. It smelled of damp earth and old grease. Silas stood by the heavy steel door, his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the floor. He wouldn't look at Adeline. He wouldn't speak to her. He was a sentinel of her despair. Adeline paced the room, her red dress torn at the hem, the ruby necklace feeling like a heavy, cold weight around her neck. He felt like a trapped animal. Every minute that passed was a minute closer to Alara's lungs seizing up. Every minute was a minute where Dorian was either killing or being killed. Silas, she said, her voice hoarse. Please. You saw that video. You know Maximilian won't hesitate. The boss is the best there is, Miss Sterling, Silas replied, his voice flat. If anyone can get her out, it's him. He's one man against a family. Adeline screamed, throwing a chair across the room. It shattered against the concrete. He's walking into a trap and he's doing it because he thinks he has to be the monster to save the day. But Maximilian doesn't want to fight. He wants a trophy. He wants me. She stopped pacing, a sudden cold clarity washing over her. She looked at Silas. You've been with him a long time, haven't you? Since he was a boy, Silas said, a flicker of emotion finally touching his face. Then you know he's not going to make it back, Adeline whispered. You know he's going there to die so he doesn't have to live with the fact that he failed us. Is that what you want? To be the man who watched the last Moretti throw his life away because he was too proud to let a woman help him? Silas's jaw worked. He looked at the door, then back at Adeline. The boss gave me an order. The boss is losing his mind. Adeline stepped into his space. I have the codes to the Holloway accounts. I have the keys to the journals. I am a Sterling, Silas. I am the one Maximilian wants. If I show up, it creates a distraction. It gives Dorian the opening he needs. If I stay here, they both die and you'll be guarding a ghost. The silence in the room was deafening. Somewhere above them, a heavy truck rumbled over the warehouse floor, shaking the ceiling. Silas reached into his jacket. For a second, Adeline thought he was going to draw his weapon. Instead, he pulled out a set of keys and a burner phone. The boss will kill me for this, Silas said, his voice a low rumble. He has to survive the night to do that, Adeline replied. Silas nodded slowly. He opened the door and gestured for her to follow. There's a black motorcycle in the loading dock. The keys are in the ignition. I've uploaded the coordinates of the Valyria stronghold to the phone's GPS. It's an old cathedral on the edge of the docks. He handed her a small, sleek pistol. It felt heavy and alien in her hand. Do you know how to use this? No, Adeline said, her heart hammering. Point and squeeze, Silas said. And Adeline, if you get them out, tell Dorian I'm sorry I couldn't be there to see him smile one last time. Adeline didn't wait. She ran. The ride through the city was a blur of freezing wind and adrenaline. She had never ridden a motorcycle before, but the desperation for Alara and the burning need for Dorian gave her a reckless, intuitive skill. She tore through the streets, the red silk of her dress fluttering behind her like a bloody banner. She reached the cathedral just as the first sounds of gunfire erupted. It was a nightmare of Gothic stone and modern violence. Muzzle flashes lit up the stained glass windows from the inside, turning the images of saints into flickering demons. Adeline ditched the bike and crept toward a side entrance, her heart in her throat. She stepped inside and the smell hit her immediately: gunpowder, incense, and blood. She moved through the shadows of the nave, her eyes searching the chaos. She saw Dorian. He was behind a fallen marble pillar, his shirt soaked in blood. She couldn't tell if it was his or someone else's. He was pinned down by 3 gunmen on the altar. He was out of ammunition, reaching for a knife, his movements sluggish. He looked exhausted. He looked defeated. And then she saw Maximilian. He was standing on the balcony above the altar, holding a remote detonator in one hand and a syringe in the other. Behind him, strapped to a chair, was Alara. Dorian. Maximilian's voice echoed through the vaulted ceiling. Look up. Look at the end of your legacy. He raised the syringe, the needle glinting in the firelight. This is the cure, Dorian. But it's also a poison if the dosage is wrong. 1 cc too much and her heart explodes. 1 cc too little and she suffocate. Which one do you think I'll choose? Dorian looked up, his face a mask of pure, unmitigated agony. He dropped the knife. He went to his knees in the middle of the aisle, his head bowed. Don't, he choked out. Please. Take me. Do whatever you want to me. Just give her the medicine. It was the darkest hour. The king was on his knees. The sister was a heartbeat away from death. And Adeline was standing in the shadows, a cheap pistol in her hand and a hole in her heart. She realized then that Dorian was right. She couldn't save them by playing their game. He had to change the game entirely. She stepped out into the light, the ruby necklace catching the firelight. Maximilian, she screamed, her voice ringing through the cathedral like a bell. Everyone froze. Dorian's head snapped toward her, his eyes widening in horror. Adeline. Run. But Adeline didn't run. She raised the gun, but she didn't point it at Maximilian. She pointed it at her own heart. You want the sterling girl? She shouted, her voice steady even as her hands shook. You want the key to the Holloway fortune? You want the woman Dorian Moretti loves? Here I am. But if you press that detonator or if you touch that needle, I pull this trigger. And you end up with nothing but a pile of dead bodies and a war with the Moretti family that you will lose. Maximilian stared at her, his eyes narrowing. The gunmen lowered their weapons, looking at their boss for direction. The silence was absolute. The tension was a wire stretched to the point of snapping. In that moment, Adeline wasn't a victim or a prize. She was the one holding the power. But as she looked at Dorian, she saw the terror in his eyes, not for himself but for her. And she realized that her darkest hour wasn't the fear of dying. It was the fear that she had finally found something worth living for, just as the world was trying to take it away. The silence that followed Adeline's ultimatum was heavy, thick with the smell of old stone and fresh copper. Even the flickering candles seemed to hold their breath. Maximilian Rothstein stood paralyzed on the balcony, the syringe hovering inches from Alara's arm. He was a man who calculated life in decimals and percentages, and Adeline had just introduced an unquantifiable variable. A woman who was willing to destroy herself to win. Dorian looked up from his knees. The blood matting his hair and the exhaustion in his limbs seemed to vanish, replaced by a terrifying incandescent light in his eyes. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw the legacy his mother had written about in those dusty journals. He saw a queen who had finally picked up her crown, even if it was made of thorns. You're bluffing, Maximilian sneered, though his voice lacked its previous silkiness. You don't have the stomach for it, Adeline. You're a socialite. You're the girl who cries when her boyfriend cheats. You aren't a killer. I don't have to be a killer to pull a trigger against my own heart, Maximilian, Adeline replied, her voice gaining a resonance that echoed through the nave. She stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble, never wavering the aim of the pistol. And I'm not a socialite. I'm a woman who has watched everyone I love be bartered away. I'm the woman who read Isabella Moretti's journals. I know about the Sovereign Protocol of 1994. I know why the Valerius family is so desperate for the Holloway land. It isn't for real estate. It's for what's buried beneath it. Maximilian's face went from pale to ghostly. The gunman shifted uneasily. The Sovereign Protocol was a ghost story in the underworld. A secret so deep it was supposed to have died with the previous generation. How could you know? Maximilian stammered. Because Dorian trusted me with the truth, Adeline lied, her eyes meeting Dorian's for a split second. In that glance, 1,000 words passed between them. She was giving him the opening. She was providing the distraction he needed to move. And because I've already set a digital timer. If my heart stops or if I don't enter a code into a specific server in the next 10 minutes, every ledger Isabella Moretti kept, every proof of your family's treason against the commission, goes live to every syndicate in the country. Dorian realized then that she was improvising, using the information from the journals to weave a web of gold and steel. It was brilliant. It was reckless. It was exactly what a Moretti would do. Dorian didn't waste another second. While Maximilian was reeling from the threat of exposure, Dorian's hand shot out, grabbing the knife he had dropped moments ago. With a surge of strength that seemed to defy his injuries, he lunged forward. He didn't go for the gunman. He went for the heavy rope coiled around a stone pillar, the one that controlled the massive iron chandelier hanging directly over the altar. Silas. Now. Dorian roared. From the high rafters above the nave, a single muzzle flash bloomed. Silas Vane hadn't stayed behind. He had followed the motorcycle, lurking in the shadows like the predator he was trained to be. His shot didn't hit a person. It hit the iron pin of the chandelier's counterweight. The sound was like a thunderclap. The massive iron ring holding hundreds of lit candles tore free from the ceiling. It plummeted, a circle of fire and metal, crashing directly into the center of the gunman. The explosion of glass and wax created a wall of flame and smoke, cutting off the balcony from the rest of the cathedral. In the chaos, Dorian was a blur of motion. He didn't run away from the fire, he ran through it. He vaulted over the marble railing of the balcony, his silhouette framed by the rising heat. Maximilian panicked. He turned toward Alara, his hand shaking as he tried to plunge the syringe into her arm. If I go down, she goes with me. No. Adeline screamed, finally turning her weapon toward the balcony. But she didn't need to fire. Dorian slammed into Maximilian with the force of a freight train. They went over the back of the chair, tumbling onto the stone floor of the balcony. The syringe flew from Maximilian's hand, skittering across the stone toward the edge. Adeline dropped her own gun and sprinted toward the altar, climbing the stairs through the smoke. Her lungs burned, her dress was scorched, but she didn't stop until she reached the chair where Alara sat. Alara. Alara, look at me. Adeline sobbed, fumbling with the heavy leather straps. Alara's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glazed. Addie? It's so cold. I've got you, Adeline whispered, her fingers bleeding as she tore at the buckles. Behind her, the sound of a brutal, visceral struggle filled the air. Dorian and Maximilian were locked in a death grip. Maximilian was older, but he was desperate and fighting with the strength of a cornered rat. He had a hidden blade in his cuff and he was slashing wildly at Dorian's chest. Dorian took the hits. He didn't flinch. He grabbed Maximilian by the throat, his fingers digging into the man's windpipe. You touched her, Dorian hissed, his voice sounding like it was being dragged over gravel. You threatened the only thing in this world that is pure. You're not going to jail, Maximilian. You're not even going to get a trial. Dorian forced Maximilian's head back over the edge of the balcony, looking down at the inferno of the fallen chandelier below. Dorian, stop. Adeline called out, finally freeing Alara's last hand. She stood up, holding her sister's shaking body against hers. Don't do it for him. Don't lose yourself in the dark just to kill a dead man. Dorian froze. He looked back at Adeline, his face a mask of blood and soot. He saw her holding Alara, the two sisters silhouetted against the stained glass. He saw the woman who had pointed a gun at her own heart to save him. The rage in his eyes flickered, replaced by a profound, soul-deep realization. If he killed Maximilian in cold blood right now, he would be the monster everyone said he was. He would be the man who couldn't let go of the darkness. He pulled Maximilian back from the edge and slammed him into the stone floor, knocking him unconscious with a single massive blow. Silas. Dorian yelled, his voice echoing through the chaos. Secure him. And get the medics in here. We have the antidote. Silas dropped from the rafters, landing with feline grace. On it, boss. Second team is through the doors. The Valerius guards are surrendering. Dorian turned toward Adeline. He didn't walk, he stumbled, his strength finally failing. Adeline met him halfway, letting Alara lean against a stone pillar as she caught him in her arms. They sank to the floor together, the heat of the fire dying down as the sprinklers finally triggered, a soft rain beginning to fall inside the cathedral. You came, Dorian whispered, his head resting on her shoulder. I told you to stay away and you came. I'm a Sterling, remember? Adeline said, her tears mixing with the water and blood. We don't know how to follow orders. Dorian let out a weak, genuine laugh. He reached up, his fingers trembling, and touched her face. You saved us, Adeline. Not the money, not the journals. You. We saved each other, she replied. As the sirens began to wail in the distance and the smoke cleared, Adeline looked at her sister, then at the man holding her. The turning point was over. They weren't just survivors anymore. They were a force. And as the dawn began to break through the shattered stained glass, Adeline realized that for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what the light would reveal. She was the queen of the shadows and her king was finally coming home. The cathedral was a graveyard of smoke and broken glass, but the air was no longer thick with the scent of death. It was heavy with the weight of an ending. As the emergency medical team, Dorian's private, elite units, swarmed the altar, the rain from the sprinklers began to subside, leaving a glistening, ethereal sheen on everything. Adeline watched as they stabilized Alara. The antidote was administered with surgical precision, and within minutes her sister's shallow, rattling breaths smoothed out into the deep, rhythmic rise and fall of true sleep. The crisis of the sickness was over, but the war for their souls had one final, bloody chapter to write. Dorian was being tended to by a medic, a jagged gash on his shoulder being stitched in the dim light of a tactical lantern. He looked up as Adeline approached, his face pale, but his eyes burning with a pride that made her heart skip a beat. It's not over, is it? She asked, her voice steady. Not quite, Dorian grunted, wincing as the needle pulled through his skin. Maximilian was the head of the snake, but the Valerius family has a dead man's switch. The moment his heart rate spiked and stayed there, an automated signal went out to their remaining cells. They won't care about him anymore. They'll care about the land. The Halloway land, Adeline whispered, the pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into place. The sovereign protocol. Tell me the truth, Dorian. What is buried under Julian's family estate? Dorian looked at Silas, who was standing guard near the unconscious Maximilian. Silas nodded and Dorian turned back to Adeline. It's not gold or drugs, Adeline. It's a data hub. 20 years ago your father, Arthur Sterling, didn't just steal money. He built a shadow network. A decentralized server that holds the digital signatures of every illicit transaction made by the 5 families and their political puppets for 3 decades. He buried the physical entry point beneath the Halloway estate because back then, the Halloways were the only ones clean enough to never be searched. My father. He was an informant? He was an insurance agent, Dorian corrected. He knew that in our world the only thing more valuable than loyalty is the ability to destroy everyone else. He wasn't a thief, he was a blackmailer. And Julian Halloway found the key. That's why he wanted to marry you, to legitimize his claim to the property and sell the access codes to the Valerius family. The sheer scale of the deception was staggering. Every kiss Julian had given her, every "I love you," had been a calculation to gain access to a graveyard of secrets. Suddenly, the heavy oak doors of the cathedral groaned. They didn't open. They were blown off their hinges by a controlled thermal charge. Through the dust and debris, a new group of men entered. They weren't wearing Valerius colors. They were wearing the suits of corporate security, Halloway's private army. And leading them, his arm in a makeshift sling and his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated megalomania, was Julian Halloway. He had escaped the basement at the Obsidian Ridge. He had played the victim one last time to gain his freedom, and now he was here for the prize. Dorian. Adeline. Julian shouted, his voice echoing with a manic edge. I have to thank you. You did the heavy lifting. You took out the Valerius old guard for me. Now the land belongs to me, the protocol belongs to me, and the city is going to learn how to crawl. Dorian tried to stand but his legs gave way. The blood loss was too much. Silas raised his rifle, but a sniper's red dot appeared on his chest from the shadows of the cathedral entrance. Don't, Silas, Julian warned. My men are all over the perimeter. They have orders to level this place if I don't walk out of here with the Sterling girl and the decryption key she's wearing around her neck. Adeline looked down at the ruby necklace. The key isn't a metaphor, is it? The ruby is a high-capacity thumb drive, Dorian whispered, his hand clutching her arm. My mother didn't just leave it to you for luck. He knew. She was the one who helped your father hide it. Adeline felt a surge of cold, hard clarity. She looked at Julian, the man who had broken her heart, the man who had traded her sister's health for power, and she felt nothing but a frozen, calculating rage. You want it, Julian? She asked, her voice ringing out through the cathedral. Come and get it. She stepped away from Dorian, walking down the steps of the altar. She looked small, fragile in her torn red dress, but she moved with the grace of a woman who had already died once and had nothing left to fear. Silas sent a message this morning, Dorian said. How is he? He's in the Swiss Alps, Dorian chuckled. Apparently he's taken up woodworking. He says the mountains are quieter when no one is shooting at you. He sent this. He found it in the ruins of the Holloway estate before the state seized the land. He opened the pouch. Inside was the ruby necklace. It had been cleaned, the soot and blood polished away until it shone like a star. I thought it was gone, Adeline whispered, touching the cool stone. The drive is wiped, Dorian said. The protocol is complete. The money has been distributed to the clinics, the orphanages, and the victims' funds. It's just a stone now, Adeline. It's just a piece of jewelry. He leaned forward, his eyes, those winter-sea eyes that had once been so cold, now filled with a warmth that was for her alone. My mother gave this to you because she knew you were the only one who could handle the weight of what it represented. But you don't have to carry that weight anymore. I want you to have it. Not as a key and not as a contract. I want you to have it as a reminder of the night you walked across a ballroom and saved a man who didn't even know he was drowning. Adeline took the necklace, but she didn't put it on. She looked at the ruby, then at the man who had become her world. I didn't just save you, Dorian, she said, her voice thick with emotion. I found myself. I spent my whole life being what other people needed me to be. A daughter, a sister, a girlfriend to a man who didn't deserve me. But with you, even in the dark, even when we were running for our lives, I felt like I was finally real. Dorian reached out, his hand cupping her cheek. His touch was no longer a claim of ownership. It was a promise of partnership. You were always real, Adeline. You were just waiting for a stage big enough for your heart. He pulled her into his arms, and as they sat there on the edge of the world, watching Alara play in the distance, the last of the shadows finally retreated. There were no more secrets. No more rules. There was only the sound of the waves and the steady, synchronized beating of two hearts that had survived the impossible. What happens now? Adeline asked, looking up at him. Dorian smiled. A real, genuine smile that reached his eyes and stayed there. Now, he said, we decide what our own rules are. And I think the first one should be that we never, ever look back. He kissed her then, and it was a taste of lemon and salt, of peace and a future that stretched out as wide and bright as the sea. The story that had begun with a spiteful kiss in a room full of enemies had ended with a kiss of choice in a garden of light. The untouchable king had been touched by a love that was stronger than any empire, and the girl who had been used as a pawn was finally the queen of her own destiny. And that, my friends, is the end of Adeline and Dorian's journey. I'm so incredibly moved by how far they've come. From a moment of desperate spite to a life of true, unburdened love. What was your favorite moment of the story? Was it the kiss at the party, the revelation in the library, or this beautiful ending? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this 1-hour emotional saga, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. We have so many more stories of passion, mystery, and redemption to tell, and I don't want you to miss a single second. Thank you for watching, and remember, even in the darkest shadows, love is the only light that can lead you home. As the sun began to set, casting a golden bridge across the water, Dorian and Adeline walked down to the beach to join Alara. Their footprints in the sand were deep and clear, a testament to where they had been, but as the tide came in, the water gently washed them away, leaving the shore smooth, clean, and ready for a brand new story to begin.